really excited to welcome Ashley Bohinc. She is the founder of Make It Middle School. She's written books. She's spoken to thousands of leaders or countless leaders about how to more effectively reach the next generation with the greatest message ever told. And so I'm really thankful for her time and what she's going to share with you. So, Ashley, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it from here.
All right. Hi, friends. So good to meet you. Thanks, Rebecca, for having me. I love the mission of youth ministry consultants. I love what you're doing. I think this is so important. It's not lost on me that I get a chance to spend an hour with all of you around the country. Just a little bit more about me. I have been communicating to teenagers, middle and high schoolers for 22 years, first in the education and athletic settings. I started my professional career in the school system, and I probably taught your favorite subject you ever took in class. I was the middle school health teacher. So I got to teach about all the fun stuff. And I have so many stories. So we should have like youth ministry health class or something and like reminisce about our stories from health class. And then I'll tell you some of mine. Um, and then I was also a soccer coach for middle and high schoolers during that time and volunteering in my youth ministry. And maybe some of you have this same story, but maybe you started as a volunteer or you are a volunteer. But I was running the middle school ministry at my local church as a volunteer during this time while I was teaching and coaching. And then they wanted to bring me on staff. And I was like, oh, no, 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 no. Like kind of kicked and screamed my way into a full-time ministry, not because I didn't like it. I just loved teaching. I loved it more my sixth year than I did my first year. But God, in all his sovereignty, had so many more plans, thank God, because it was really cool to see when I made that jump from the school system to the church in that same community, um, how many families on the East Coast, I was in Maryland when I taught, how many of them followed me over into the church. So that was amazing. Me personally, I grew up in a family that we talked a ton about faith and I knew all about Jesus, but it was going to my very first youth summer camp in Colorado, actually, where finally understood like why I needed Jesus. Funny enough, the communicator was talking about how to share your faith with a non-believer and how do you have that type of conversation. It was amazing, but it was actually the first time I understood why I needed Jesus. So it worked, which was great. I had always known about Jesus. I just didn't fully understand the personal relationship until I was 17 years old. And so for me, that communicator spoke in a way that took all of these, seeds my parents had planted along the way and connected the dots for me in a way that made sense. And then from that point forward, I had found Jesus. Now I had to figure out what it looked like to follow Jesus with my life. And so I have been passionate about teaching. Like growing up, I never played baby Barbie wedding house. I played teacher. I gave the neighbors homework, got mad when they didn't do it because I wanted to grade it. Like I have always been passionate about communicating. I just didn't always know I could do that in a church. And so I started as the volunteer, like communicating in the church while I was teaching. And then God kind of, opened some doors and helped grow me in that way. And then started doing that professionally. So I have worked in two different churches. The first church that I worked in, we had a Saturday and a Sunday morning service. And I'm telling you this because I hope it will help you contextually understand that I can feel some of your pain. My Saturday night service started with one student and 5 volunteers. And if that's you, I know how hard that can be when you have like one student show up and how awkward that can be. But figured out how to grow that ministry from one student to 40 on Saturdays. And then Sunday morning was a totally different animal because I had 60 7th and 8th graders show up on Sunday morning. So like the way I had to plan my two services was so opposite of each other. So I loved that. And then I moved down to Atlanta, Georgia, which is where I live now. And I was on staff at a church here called North Point, which is a multi-site church. And I know that's a huge church, but let me say our smallest campus had 9 middle schoolers showing up to it. So it's not like every single campus is huge. There are some really ginormous campuses where we have 1,000 middle schoolers showing up on a weekend, but we also have 5 to 9 on some of our smaller campuses. So I feel like what it's done is really, helped me learn how to contextualize in different environments. But what I can say is and this is why I put this whole training together, is I think, I mean, you already know this. This is why you're here. You know, we have the most important message on the entire planet that's been entrusted to us. And we, as communicators, have a responsibility to keep getting better, whether we've done this for 20 days or we've done it for 20 years. Like, we should all be sharpening our craft and trying to get better. I personally have been doing it for 22 years, and I feel like I still have so much to learn. And every time I communicate to students or I have conversations with leaders like all of you, I learn another little 1% way that I can get better as a communicator. Sometimes I walk off, from doing a lesson in front of students, and I'm like, I just broke my own rule there. What the heck was that? It's because being intentional about communicating to teenagers who you're communicating to with should change the way you communicate. Not change the gospel, but change the way in which you talk about it and the way you break it down. So that's what I want to talk about specifically today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can show you guys some slides. Um, I also, Rebecca, I can just share my slide deck with you if you want to send that out afterwards so y'all don't have to like be typing or writing as much. I'd rather you just listen. You will need a piece of paper and a pen at one point in this. I'm going to have you do a little bit of an activity. So make sure you have that available. Okay, multitasking. Here we go. Okay. Rebecca, are we good? You can see my slides? Okay, perfect. All right, so let me go. Okay, first I want to start off with this thought is a teenager's ability to receive information is significantly less than our ability to transmit information. Here's what I'm saying is like, we have probably been sitting in content as we're preparing to teach teenagers for, I don't know, maybe for you it's 48 hours, maybe for you it's 2 weeks, maybe for you it's 2 months, depending on how much time you put into preparing and what talk it is. But you've been sitting in that content, researching it. Maybe you've heard 10 sermons in your life on this specific passage. But the truth is we typically only probably communicate 5% of the information that we have researched or absorbed about the content. We should not be communicating all 100% of the information we're absorbing, or they're not going to get any of it. So keep in mind that their ability to receive is significantly less than our ability to transmit information. Let me tell you a little. I'm a nerd, so I love like the science of learning and how the memory and the brain work. So like nerd out with me for just a second. Every time we process information as adults and as teenagers, we use our working memory, which is what you see in the yellowish gold right there. The working memory is extremely limited. Working memory basically has to hear the information and then figure out what you're saying and then reach back into your library in your brain and attach that information to something you already know so that you can actually like keep that information in your brain. If it doesn't have anything to attach it to, it's not going to stay in your brain. That's exactly how the brain works, which is partially why when you're leading teenagers, you're teaching about something and then they bring up something totally random and you're off on a rabbit trail. It's because their little brains are trying to attach it to something in their life that they have either experienced before or they know about, something they just read about. Even if you're like, this has nothing to do with it, that is their brain trying to attach the information. So it's actually a very normal part of the learning process, as frustrating as it can be. But keep in mind that first time the students, they're hearing this information for the first time and relating it in real time to their life. It's their first exposure to the information. So their working memory is working overtime to make sense of what you're saying and attach it to something in their brain where you have probably sat in this information for a long period of time. And this is hard work. It's hard work on your brain. In fact, you might even feel like your brain is tired after hearing me talk for 45 minutes. So you're probably going to personally experience the very thing that I'm talking about. But the truth is when you look at the research of learning, we don't actually have as much time with teenagers as we think, which means we have to be very, very, very intentional about how we're communicating the most important message on the planet, or they're going to miss it. So I want you to imagine with me for just a second that this is called the 100 pennies rule. Okay. Imagine that every single student you have has 100 pennies of mental energy to burn every time you communicate to them. Okay. So, and keep in mind, when you've burned all the pennies, they're gone. They're done. They've shut down. They're not absorbing any other information. 100 pennies to burn. And that is like every story you tell, every word you say, every picture you show, every video you show, every joke you make burns pennies. Every single thing you say and do burns pennies. Okay. And especially if it's information they've never heard before, or it's information that doesn't make sense, or the order in which you're presenting the information doesn't make sense to them, then you burn pennies. And the extraordinary communicator burns pennies incredibly sparingly because you know you have finite information. Your brain has finite ability to absorb information. Um, you always need to consider as a communicator, how many pennies is this burning with my audience for every point that I make in a presentation or in a sermon or a message to students. So you always want to, shoot for a high ROI where they burn only a few pennies for the return of a huge teaching point. I would say don't burn pennies on something that isn't the point. And that's a really good filter to take yourself through as you're walking through your sermon and rehearsing your sermon, making sure you're not spending too much time on something that burns pennies that's insignificant. So be as brief as possible. Remember, you have 100 pennies. That's assuming you get all 100 pennies. That's assuming they haven't burned the pennies in the game or in the hosting or in the worship song or something the worship leader said or in the conversation in the car on the way to youth group. Like that's just assuming you get all 100. And so keep in mind, like be brief and to the point so that you don't empty the pennies before they've had a chance to talk about it in groups and personalize it for themselves. Um, I always do something called the reduction test where I go through my message and I'm like, if I took this out, would it still make sense? If I took this out, would it still make sense? And reduce and reduce and reduce and reduce so that you strategically use those pennies that you have to actually communicate the truth and the message. Keep in mind, like complexity in general torches all of the pennies, it torches them. Confusion is death when it comes to penny burning. And so making sure that you have thought through what this looks like is so important. What I want to do with the rest of our time today is take you through 5 ways that you can sharpen your communication skills to teenagers, sharpen the way that you prepare and the way that you deliver when you are talking to students. Every team I've ever led, I told you I was a coach for a while, but this is also true for every volunteer team I've led and every staff team I've led, is championship teams, they aren't 100% better than everyone. Championship teams are 1% better in 100 different ways. And the same thing is true with strong volunteer teams. The same thing is true with extraordinary communicators. They're not 100% better than every other communicator. They're 1% better in 100 different ways. And so these 5 things I want to talk about today, these are 1% tweaks and ways you can think about when you're designing and delivering your messages that can help you not just be the best, that's not the goal, but to communicate the most important information on the planet to the students we've been entrusted with. The first shift I want to challenge all of us to think about is the whole idea of the difference between communicating and speaking. Those are 2 very different things. Let me unpack what I mean by that. Communicating is 2 way. Speaking is 1 way. Right now, I'm speaking to you. If you guys were off of mute and you were also having, part of this conversation, that would be more communicating. This is our normal way in our culture that we communicate information is typically we speak at people. We will have a chance at the end of this and in the middle of it to do a little bit more communicating. But you've been working with this next generation of kids and teenagers. The way that they best respond is when you communicate with them, not speak at them. Sorry, guys, little cough here. I'm sure you're all struggling with this too. Communicating is typically more authentic. It's more genuine. It's more, I'm sitting across from you at the table at Starbucks having a hot chocolate, where speaking is more formal or more authoritative in nature. And some of you are sitting there thinking, like, I've only seen people speak. I haven't really seen somebody communicate. So that's interesting. Or I grew up with someone always speaking at me, not necessarily communicating to me, but it's just a shift in the way in which we're thinking about this information. Communicating establishes trust and relationship, where speaking aims to just convey information. So when you communicate to someone, it's more than just your words. It's the way in which you're listening to them, actively listening to them. It's the way in which you're smiling. It's the way you're responding. It's when they say something to you, you respond and encourage their feedback. You're basically establishing trust and that relationship, which is exactly how Rebecca opened this entire session. So that was a perfect example of what that looks like. Okay, and communicating is typically appropriate language and tone and the willingness to explain concepts, where speaking just uses words, phrase, concepts without explanation. Typically, somebody who's speaking at a group of students or at a group of people in a room, it's like, this is the way I'm going to say it. So you either absorb it or you don't. You either understand it or you don't, or you go find out the information a different way. Where communicating would be willing to break things down, willing to explain it, willing to even be asked questions about some of the information. Both of my degrees are in education, and we talked a ton about active learning versus passive learning. Communicating is active learning. That invites students into the learning process. It's discovery learning. It's letting them discover some of the truths, not just us tell them everything. When you're speaking at someone, basically learning is happening to you, but you're not part of the learning process. You might be listening to the information, but you don't have to do anything in order to get that information. You're just sitting and listening. Whereas active learning is you invite them into the learning process. We talked a ton about different teaching models and pedagogy in our degrees. And one of the things we talked a lot about is the whole idea of the difference between the sage on the stage and the guide on the side. This is very much the difference between speaking and communicating. Speaking is the sage on the stage. I have studied my whole life. I've studied this my whole life. I'm going to stand up here and tell you everything that I know. I am the one who has all the information. I will communicate it to all of you so that you have the information. That is what sage on the stage. It's not a bad thing. There are some environments where that is totally appropriate. When it comes to leading the next generation, a guide on the side approach is less I have all the information, but maybe instead of the best answer giver, I'm the best question asker. So I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to let students talk about it. I'm going to let them personalize it. I'm going to let them debate. I'm going to let them jump into scripture and try to find out, what did Jesus say about this? So you invite them into the learning process. So there's a shift from, I have all the information, let me communicate it to you, to let me help invite you into the learning process so you discover that information. Because when we do something with the information we have discovered, meaning we write it down, we talk about it with people around us, there is a higher chance that we retain that information for the long haul. The second shift I would love to invite you into is the shift between listening versus reading. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, and is the difference between listening comprehension and reading comprehension. Here we go. Listening comprehension is the ability to understand spoken language, where reading comprehension is the ability to understand written language. Listening comprehension, the pace is often beyond their control, where reading comprehension, they have more control over the pace of their learning. Listening, they can't go back if they're distracted or if they're confused or they don't know what a word means. Where reading comprehension, they can easily go back and reread that word in the context of the sentence until they can understand what the meaning of that is. So the reason that this is important is, like, somebody might have a reading comprehension level of 10th grade, but they may have a listening comprehension level of 6th grade. So understanding that they may understand this word or this concept when they're reading scripture in context of what's happening, that's one thing to consider. But then you think, okay, if listening comprehension is usually a lower comprehension level than reading, then that means we need to back it up a little bit and think about how we're explaining some concepts, because we all know spiritual concepts are incredibly abstract and incredibly complex for a brain that's going through puberty. And so if we know their listening comprehension is typically a few years behind their reading comprehension, that should adjust the way in which we're preparing, designing, and delivering our messages to teenagers. Again, we have the most important message on the entire planet. Too much hangs in the balance for us to not get this right. Okay, that brings me into my third of 5 things that I want you to consider. And we're going to pause at this next one and do a little bit of an activity and invite you into this learning process. But it's the whole idea of, if we know listening and reading comprehension is different than abstract and concrete. Oh, let me say one more thing actually about listening and reading comprehension. I do a lot of work in Ethiopia, and so it wasn't actually until I spent a lot of time in Ethiopia that I learned, that not only do they take English classes in their schools there, but they take English written and English spoken. And they're 2 totally different skill sets that they have to take English for. And I was like, oh, well, why don't we do that? I mean, I guess we do in our English classes, that like we write and we speak. And I guess maybe it's just comprehensive in how that works, but it was interesting to see that even schools around the world separate those skill sets and help them develop both skill sets. So that's important for us as youth leaders to do as well. Okay, abstract versus concrete. You've probably heard these words before. Let's break down the difference and the similarities between them. A concrete thinker, or concrete language, talks about objects in specific physical details. Abstract thinkers or communicators are ideas and concepts, but they lack physicality. Concrete is specific and observable, where abstract is more general and universal in nature. Concrete is objective and less open to interpretation. Like everybody can see that this is what's happening right now. Where abstract is more subjective and open to interpretation, especially open to the interpretation of a judge. Was that a good performance on America's Got Talent? I'm not sure. Let's hear what the judges say. Okay. It doesn't mean everybody in the room agrees on that. A more concrete way of thinking requires less explanation because it's more clear, where abstract, it requires additional explanation because it might be more compelling or clever or creative than it is clear. And we love to be clever, creative, and compelling when it comes to faith. And if we can be all of them, clever, compelling, creative, and clear, that's the secret sauce right there. But a lot of times we sacrifice being clear for being like compelling or clever, and it really cloudies the water for students, especially when it comes to their listening comprehension level. I don't know if you're a Friends fan or not of the television show. I am, and I cannot get past this scene without thinking about this tension between abstract and concrete. So listen to this, because this is a great example. Let me make sure I can play this. Okay.
Too sophisticated for you.
It doesn't make any sense.
Of course it does. It's smart. I used a thesaurus. On every word? Yep.
What was this sentence originally?
Oh, they are warm, nice people with big hearts. And that became, they are human prepossessing Homo sapiens with full-sized aortic pumps. Yeah.
Okay. So I love that example because I think it does such a good job of showing like they really used like Joey tried to use words to sound smart, which we do all the time as ministry leaders. We want to sound smart. We want to sound educated. We want to sound like we know what we're talking about. But in our effort to do that, a lot of times we lose the very audience that we are setting out to reach. So we should never use $5 words when a 5-cent word would suffice. And so that is what this whole next section is going to be about.
Too sophisticated for you.
Let me go to the
Too
next slide.
sophisticated for you.
Okay. The difference between watering down, dumbing down, and breaking something down. Watering something down makes something weaker or less effective. Dumbing down lowers the level of difficulty or intelligence, where breaking a word or concept down just separates something into smaller parts. So when we're talking about teenagers, especially teenagers who are walking through puberty and their brains are doing this total rewiring, and they are basically shifting from concrete thinkers to abstract thinkers. Now, this is not a generalization. There are some 7-year-olds who are probably more abstract thinkers than 20-year-olds, but that's few and far between. You technically can't think abstractly until you go through puberty. That's one of the things you gain during puberty, is the ability to think abstractly. And so it's important that we're not just watering things down or dumbing things down. It's not about using basic language. It's just about breaking content and breaking something down into smaller pieces so that they can grasp that information, especially when you're considering their listening comprehension. Just like a toddler can eat a hamburger and needs the nutrients in that burger in order to keep growing, they just consume it different. They consume it in little bites, not in this whole patty that they have to take a bite of. The same thing is true when it comes to communicating to teenagers. Okay. In the whole spirit of, we've got 100 pennies and we don't want to burn them. We want to use them very, very creatively and very intentionally. If we think about, like, being abstract is more high in the sky, it lacks physicality, and more concrete is on the ground. Think of literal concrete on the ground, like this is what it is, and there's no changing it or second guessing it. I always think about it in this kind of a continuum. And I take a word like apple, okay? This is just an example, okay? This is a skill set that it burns a lot of pennies to do this activity, but it's one of the most helpful things that I've learned over the years that help me kind of go through all of my sermons and think to myself, do I need to do this skill and this activity in order to get to the word or phrase that might burn less pennies but make the same point? So the word apple, okay? If I want to build that up to be more abstract, I can. If I want to break that down to be more concrete, I can. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, a more abstract way of saying apple is a fruit, right? It's more general. It's not specific to apple. Okay, a more abstract way to say fruit would be produce, because produce would include fruits and vegetables. So if you see, as I'm building it up to be more abstract, I'm using words that are higher in the sky. Now let's go ahead and break the word apple down to be more concrete. A more concrete way to say an apple is a red apple. It's being specific about the color, right? Okay, how about a Honeycrisp apple that's red? Or how about the Honeycrisp apple your mother packed you for lunch? Not just any Honeycrisp apple, but that specific Honeycrisp apple. If you can see, we start with the word apple, we can go up and we can break it down. Okay, this looks kind of easy when it comes to the word apple, but one thing I want to point out to you is the younger the age group that we're communicating to, a lot of times are like, people say, communicate in shorter spurts of time. The problem is when you use more concrete language, you need more words. So if you even just look at the word apple, I mean, everyone knows what an apple is, but if I was saying use the most concrete language you can in this talk, you would have to use a whole sentence to explain the word apple. So that means you have to say less because you need more words to break down what you're saying to that age group. And so that's really, really important. Now I'm going to throw it over to you and give you guys a little bit of time. I'm putting up here on the screen a bunch of like Christian words, phrases, concepts, things that we say in Christian culture or that we find in scripture. Go ahead. I want you to pick one or two of these. First, pick it, write it down on a piece of paper. You're gonna have a few minutes to try to do this yourself. And I'll put the sample back on the screen so you can see how I built it up and broke it down. But first, pick one or two of these words or phrases that you're gonna try to build up or break down, or both. Okay, everybody, well, if you have a video on, give me a thumbs up that you have your word or phrase that you picked. Thumbs up, thumbs up. Neil, thank you. Paula, thank you. Okay, all right. I'm going to go back a slide just so you can have an example. I'm going to give you just a few minutes. I want you to draw that same circle, the arrow up and down with abstract and concrete. So, can I go back? Yes. Oops. abstract at the top, concrete at the bottom, put that arrow, put the word in the middle, try to figure out ways to build it up to be more abstract and ways to break it down to be more concrete. I'm going to give you a few minutes to go ahead and do that.
I should have had soft music queued up for this activity.
I should have given you that heads up. That's my bad.
No, I'm just kidding.
Are your brains hurting yet? No?
I found it challenging.
We'll do like one more minute. All right. Let's first I want to ask in the chat, was it harder for you to build the word up to be more abstract, or was it harder and more challenging for you to break it down to be more concrete? So in the chat, go ahead and drop like which of the two was harder for you, because in my experience, it's usually one of both ways. Like, and it's interesting, like the way you lean towards, like, I like to communicate to older audiences or I like to communicate to younger audiences because you're used to having to do that to break it down or build it up. Harder to make it concrete, harder, easier to go abstract, equally hard. Concrete was harder, harder to be more abstract, harder to be more concrete, harder to be abstract, easier to go. Okay. Rebecca, thank you for my typo on my slide. Sorry, guys. I will definitely fix that. Okay, harder to be abstract. I know, I think for me, it's harder for me to be abstract sometimes. But let me just show you. I'm just gonna pick these two, church and sin, as like to show an example of how I might break these down. Especially if we're considering that their listening comprehension is typically a little bit less than their reading comprehension. and knowing that our listeners are walking through puberty, which it means they're just learning how to think abstractly. And we don't want to burn pennies when we don't have to burn pennies because we want them to understand the point and the concept. Um, Let me start off by saying this. There isn't like a right way. It's not like there's just one way to break the word church down or one way to break the word sin down, okay? And I mean, maybe even denominationally, people would disagree with some of the ways you would break these words down. So just know, give me all the grace in knowing that, if that makes sense. And I'm just using this as an example. Okay, church, capital C church, maybe a more concrete way of saying that would be like believers. Okay, what do we mean by believers? We mean Christians. Well, what do we mean by Christians? Well, people who believe Jesus is the Son of God. Okay, what do you mean people who believe Jesus is the Son of God? Then I might say a specific church, Life Point, the people of Life Point Church. Okay, then it's not just a group of people, it's the seventh grade boys small group leader, Abel, is who I'm talking about. You can see how we go from church, capital C, global church, to a group of people, to a more specific way to refer to the group of people based on their shared value, a specific church that gathers down to a specific person. So as we're teaching a lesson, the more often we can use concrete language, which means we might have to give more examples, the quicker they're going to follow us in their listening, and they're going to follow us to the point. The minute that they miss the connection piece, we've lost them, and they burn so many pennies, because remember, confusion kills pennies like no other, torches them. And so here's another example. Sin, maybe a more concrete way to say that is mistakes. Maybe a more concrete way to say that is things you do that you don't want people to know about, or the lie you told your parent on Saturday, or the specific sin, the telling your stepdad you were at Gus's house when you were really at Amaya's house. And so a lot of times it's easier for us as adults to just say the sin, and we know everyone on this call, or we can contextualize what we're talking about. But a seventh grader or a ninth grader is like, what does that word mean again in the context of this conversation? And then you've moved on as the communicator, and they're still there, and they missed your point. And the point wasn't necessarily this, it was just an example of maybe what I'm talking about. There are so many ways we can break these words and phrases down. And a lot of times we as communicators need to do this before we ever deliver the message so that we can make sure they get the entire point. I have a free download for you, and I think Rebecca was going to include it in the follow-up email, but I have put together this communicating to teenagers cheat sheet. This is not exhaustive by any means. It's just a list of some words or phrases, idiomatic phrases, which we love to use in the English language, and like common Christian phrases that are maybe more insider focused. Like if you've grown up in church, you know what that means. But if you're brand new to church, which a lot of Gen Z and Gen Alpha are new to church, they might not know what we mean by something like that. So this is just a starting place. Again, it's one way to break it down. It's not the right way to break it down. So please, give me all the grace in that. You probably have a better idea with that. But I'm definitely curious. What if you want to put in the chat what word you chose, and like if how you chose to break it down or build it up, or what you landed on. I would love to see some of those. I'm gonna give you just a second to go ahead and, oh, we're showing pictures. Neil, look at you. Oh, look at that. I can't even read it because my whole screen is.
You're welcome to unmute too if you want to talk us through it.
Yeah, I want to hear it. Neil, can you tell us?
I did it in light of, and I probably did it wrong. But I was thinking more abstract of like, so in light of, I think biblically, I think of like within the context, getting more abstract, the fuller story, seeing the big picture. And then I was thinking of like in light of, okay, how do you make that more concrete? Maybe looking around, or juxtaposing is actually a bigger word that you need to explain, right? So you burn some pennies with that one.
Yep.
But making more like next to, like, a real simple way to say juxtapose is, just the idea that's next to the other idea.
That's
So,
good. That's
yeah.
hard one. In light of. It's
Yeah.
like that's such an idiomatic phrase that we use in our language, and you just can talk to an adult and everyone knows what it means. And
Right.
then you have the sixth grader who's like, why are we talking about the lights on the ceiling?
Yeah. And in church, we got to talk about context all the time. And
Totally.
super important. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you for sharing that, Neil. Okay, let me keep going. So we make sure we have some time for more discussion and questions at the end. But the fourth shift I want to challenge everyone on this call to think about is the difference between macro learning and micro learning. I think this one's really, really important, especially when it comes to Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And I know that your Lisette Frazier, I think in your call next month, is doing a whole presentation on Gen Z and Gen Alpha, which is awesome. The church started talking about Gen Z way too late. So I am thrilled that the church is talking about Gen Alpha already because they are not just in our ministries, they're in our high school ministries, ninth graders this year. So, or some of them are ninth graders this year, I should say. So that's huge. But this is a huge thing that keeps coming up in research about Gen Alpha specifically, and is also true about Gen Z. The difference between macro learning and micro learning. Macro learning is longer in duration and broader in topic, where micro learning is shorter in duration. It's focused and delivers specific chunks of information. Macro learning is structured, sequenced to cover a significant amount of content systematically. So think of like a class or a workshop, a master class, a seminar where you have like a syllabus and you follow through the syllabus and make sure you hit all of these foundational pieces, where micro learning focuses on a single learning objective or topic. It allows the learners to consume the information quickly and efficiently. This is exactly what we do when we scroll TikTok or we scroll Facebook stories or reels or Instagram reels. We are micro learning. I'm like, in 30 seconds, I just learned how I can store the trash bags under my sink to look less cluttered and be more effective in how I pull my trash bag out in literally 30 seconds, 27 seconds. I can literally change something. I've learned it in that moment where there's no systematic way I'm learning that. It's just little chunks of information. Macro learning is delivered through various methods like lectures, online courses, textbooks, multimedia resources, webinars like this, Zoom calls, where micro learning is typically delivered through short videos, infographics, podcasts, interactive quizzes, or other easily digestible formats that can be accessed on multiple devices. Macro learning focuses on building a strong foundational knowledge base, where micro learning is effective for just-in-time learning and on-the-job support. It's like I'm trying to figure out how to clean my water thermos thing. And I look it up, and then in 15 seconds, I can know how to sterilize it, and I'm good to go. I don't have to watch a 10-minute video. I can make it in very, very small chunks that just get to the point fast. Macro learning offers collaboration for deep discussion, collaboration with peers, interaction with instructors. It facilitates in-depth exploration and critical thinking, where micro learning encourages engagement through interactive elements, gamification, which we are experts at in youth ministry, and quick quizzes to maintain the learner's interest and enhance retention. The thing is we have all probably traditionally learned macro learning, the macro learning style. And there is, let me just say this, there is an appropriate time for both of these. These are both great things. But what we're seeing in terms of research with Gen Z and Gen Alpha is everything is leaning towards micro learning. They're saying the attention span is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, especially because, like, when you think of how long commercials used to be, which now they have to be like 3 seconds. When you think about videos they see online, they start with the hook. They don't start with a connection piece. So they get to the point right away because within 1 second, they're going to scroll past. And the same thing's true with the way that we're communicating the most important message on the planet. Obviously, in different environments, we might have longer periods of time. Micro learning is typically defined as anything from like 3 seconds to 10 minutes tops. And macro learning is typically a format that's a little bit longer than that. This would be considered more of a macro learning conversation because there's a lot of information at one time. So this is a challenge for us because our students are micro learning on their own time. When we look at stats that say how many hours a day they're spending online or they're playing video games or whatever, they're micro learning that whole time. There are things that are popping up. They're scrolling through different things and they're learning a ton every given second. It might not be in any kind of order, but what does it look like for us as youth ministry leaders? Like, how do we adjust and design our messages that make sense with the way that they're learning? Not that they can't macro learn. They should all obviously macro learn. They need a good foundation. But how do we communicate it in a way that makes sense to their culture? So that's one thing that I wanted to throw out there. And last but not least, in the whole breaking of content down, especially using more concrete language than abstract language. It's really important that we address the tension between a condescending tone versus elevating respect. And this is really hard because we naturally do this as people who are older than the kids and teenagers we lead. And we sometimes unintentionally shut them down before they've even heard the most important message. Here's what I mean. A condescending tone would say something like, I'm sure most of you have never seen this before. That tells a teenager that you think you're better than they are and they don't want to listen to you, even though they probably haven't seen it before. It's the way in which we're talking to them, right? So elevating respect would be like, you've probably already seen this, but just, let me show you, you've already seen it. Let's talk about it. Have a conversation about it. You haven't experienced enough to have an opinion on this yet, I'm sure, but even if we say it friendly like that, it's a whole other thing if we sound angry when we say it or we sound like we're smarter than them. But when we say things like, you already know, it assumes they're smart. It assumes respect. I mean, nobody likes when communicators talk to you like you're dumb. And that's true for kids and teenagers too. You'll make better decisions as you get older, because I did, as opposed to elevating respect would be obviously you want to make great decisions. It's assuming they already want to do that. They are more inclined to lean forward and listen to you as a communicator as you communicate the most important message on the planet. If you're communicating in a way that builds that trust, it makes them want to care what you have to say. And lastly, another example is like, trust me, I know what's best for you. Like, I'm 41 years old. I know what's best, as opposed to, I don't need to tell you that, even though you probably need to tell them that. You know what I mean? Because their brains have rewired since the last time you talked about this. But assuming that they already have that information just helps them not shut anything down or get frustrated at you as a communicator. Because when they get frustrated at you as the communicator, guess what? We burn some pennies. When we have other emotions enter the chat, then we burn some pennies. And remember, a very, very intentional communicator burns pennies very incredibly sparingly because they know that our working memory is finite and they want to make sure that that kid walks away with the most important information. Now, we've just talked about all of this and we have, let's see, Rebecca, we don't have very much longer left because, I had a lot to say. I tried to talk really fast, but I did prepare a few questions. I'm going to put maybe Rebecca, can I put all 4 questions up? And if somebody wants to answer one of those questions, maybe. I also want to leave time for questions if that's helpful, or if they want to process this at the end, you decide.
Yeah, I think let's put them up. And while you read this, go ahead and put in the chat if you have questions that you want to ask Ashley or you want to ask the group. I'm a big believer that there's a lot of wisdom in spaces like this in the context we serve. So if there's something you want to discuss, go ahead and throw it in the chat. But these questions are so important for taking what we've thought about today and reflected on and making it personal. Our goal is that you don't just come to these and hear great information, but you can take it and do something with it. And so go ahead and read through these. And if there's one that really stands out, feel free to unmute and process that. While you do that, I'm going to put some links in the chat of where you can find Ashley and her ministry. I can answer one of them. The first one, I know that I unintentionally burn pennies when I'm not prepared and when I'm thinking out loud with students, when I'm trying to catch up my message with my thoughts because I came in unprepared. So they're trying to track with me and they're burning pennies as they're trying to figure out where we're going as I'm trying to get us there too.
I love that. And one of the things that I've read a lot about is like our transition statements and like the architecture of our message. Our transition from one thought to the next should be answering the question their brain is asking. If it's not, you burn double the pennies because they're like having to do gymnastics to keep up with us, where it's like, what are they going to be thinking in their brain at this moment? So it requires like that extra prep time, which all of us are like, we don't have more prep time. We're doing 3 jobs right now to survive, you know? So I totally get that tension. And I feel that too, Rebecca.
That's why we're talking about curriculum in a little bit, because not all of us have time to rewrite it all. Kayla said, I think we do a great job of communicating rather than speaking, but we need to work on listening versus reading. Yeah, that is an important thing to try and incorporate. All right. So some questions, as we have a couple minutes left. Neil said, how do you navigate micro and macro when your church is filled with many homeschool students who are often still in macro?
Well, that's a good question. I I think that it's not that it's bad for them to be in macro. If they can macro learn, great, let them macro learn. That's amazing. But I would say in micro learning, sometimes it's just like breaking up the content instead of like being like, I'm going to teach them for 20 minutes and then let them have a conversation about it. Sometimes adopting the mindset of micro learning might be, I'm going to talk for 3 minutes and then tell them to turn to the people around them and process it. I'm going to talk for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and I'm going to have them do an activity. Then I'm going to talk for 3 more minutes. So it's like breaking up the content. So what you're doing is you're allowing them to personalize, process, and apply the information, at least when you have control of that time, as they're experiencing it real time. So they're more likely to retain the information. I don't know if that answers it. I don't know if I'm not understanding, but I don't think them being homeschool and what they're doing at home needs to impact what you're doing because you can still cover the amount of the information. It's just the way you're covering it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that gets at Jonathan's question too on tips for communicating in a way that fosters community between students. I love talk and turn moments or ways to break up and help them hear themselves processing it. That helps them connect a lot of dots too. But any other ideas on fostering community and getting them to talk with one another?
I mean, first I would say it's like building a culture where you're safe to have that kind of conversation and is like it's going to take time to build that kind of a community and that expectation. I would say how familiar are the students with each other and with the leaders that are sitting with them? Like, is it changing all the time? Maybe students aren't coming regularly to one of the services and they flip-flop between them, or they're only coming once every 4 weeks, which is what we're seeing across the board, something like that. So every time a 12-year-old comes to church and they're only coming once every 3 or 4 weeks, it feels like starting over every time for them. So like you're having to start from zero or negative even because they feel like, oh, I'm not remembered. I wasn't here long enough, you know? So how familiar are they? Have you done something fun that gets them to connect with each other before you ever ask them to connect about something serious? So that's why we play games, right? Why we play games with youth ministry, or even talking to them about something they're passionate about. The other thing that I have found is a lot of times they don't know exactly what they're being asked because we might say something like, "How was your day?" And they're like, "I don't know how to answer this question," because like, what exactly do you want to know about? So if we ask more specific, we take the same mindset of breaking down the words and concepts. What if we asked, so how was lunch today? What funny thing happened at lunch today? How was the bus ride? You ask a more specific question. What did you guys talk about on the bus? Or what are people like listening to or doing when you're on the bus ride home from school? Or what drills did you do at soccer practice this afternoon? So you ask more specific questions, just like you communicate more concretely. They probably feel more confident answering that because they know the answer to it. Does that make sense? Sometimes asking more close-ended questions like, prohibits us from having a better conversation. So a closed-ended conversation would be something that has a right answer, a yes or no answer, or a 1, 2, 3 answer, or a time of the day or day of the week, if there's a right answer, it's a lot of times hard for them to elaborate. So asking more open-ended questions and creating a safe place for you to disagree with each other will communicate to each other, to everyone else in the room, that it's safe to have a conversation about something, even if you're wrong. So, like, if a kid answers and you're like, I don't think that's right, no other kid is going to ever talk in the group because they're like, I don't want to be the person who's wrong, especially when it comes to faith. Isn't the whole point to be right here? You know what I mean? Like, I want to do good here. I don't want to look stupid. So it's like our response when a kid does talk, like, oh, I love that thought. Actually, I've never thought about that before. I'm so glad you said that. Like, you are encouraging the feedback from the students. And just keep in mind, it will take time to build that type of culture. So don't get discouraged.
Absolutely. Shelley said one issue is getting students to show up so we can communicate with them. This current group of middle schoolers tends to be less willing to show up due to anxiety and being overwhelmed. Any suggestions?
That's a great question. I would ask, I think very much in the middle school phase, especially younger middle school students, like I would say like pre seventh grade Christmas, first semester, seventh grade, that whole sixth grade and first semester, seventh grade specifically, the parents' involvement is so important. So I would be curious, like, are you having parent meetings where you're casting vision for the importance of consistency of either showing up, um, and showing up if you have like more than one service time, or showing up in a group chat, like something like that, where they're showing up consistently so they feel more comfortable and it doesn't become a trigger for them, it becomes a source of comfort. I would also ask the question, and this is another thing I feel like we need to shift when it comes to Gen Alpha, is for so long we've trained our volunteers like this is what you do when you show up to our program. When the students show up, this is what you do. When a parent shows up, this is how you talk to them. When a new person shows up, this is what you do. With a world that's decentralizing, school has decentralized, church has decentralized, friendships have decentralized. What I mean by that is up until this, like back in the day, you were friends with the people you were around, the people who were in your class, the people who rode your bus, the people you live next to, the people who are friends with your parents, right? That's typically who you were exposed to, but it's decentralized. There is no longer homeschool and public school or private school in person. There's a whole hybrid of options when it comes to school because it's decentralized. You don't have to just go to one building to get it. There are so many options now. Friends, I mean, our 12 and 14 and 16-year-olds are friends with people across the world that they game with every night. They've never met them in person, but they consider them just as good of a friend as you would consider the person that you work with. And so the decentralization of everything, I, in my humble opinion, think we need to shift to a whole mindset of how do we coach our volunteers to engage with the roster, everyone they're responsible for, regardless if they show up for our program. So shifting from who's roll call, who showed up, who am I showing up for this week? How do I show up for them in their life, regardless if they ever show up for our program? Because I think when we start doing that, we see students engage with adults in their life and people in their life that are safe, that are pointing them to Jesus in a way maybe we haven't in a long time.
I love that. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here today. I put a link in the chat to a survey. This just helps us continue to plan these. We want to host conversations with questions you're really asking. And so that helps us shape these times together. Check out the links about Make It Middle School and Ashley's website and follow the work that she's doing. This was great content today. And I'm excited for the ways it'll impact our communication, but also the ways that when we're talking to our teams and helping shape like Sunday morning experiences, there's so many nuggets here that we can weave into conversations with our senior leadership about preaching and helping students connect in those different spaces too. So that's fantastic. I hope you'll join us next month as we hang out with Lisette and yeah, check out all of the ways that we can support you. We'd love to coach or train or whatever you need. We'll figure it out. We want you to win and be effective in ministry. So thank you for your time today. Thank you, Ashley, and we'll see you back here next month.